James Reynolds gripped the steering wheel, his eyes locked on the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. The bright glow illuminated the quiet road around him, cutting through the darkness like a warning sign. His heart remained steady, but his mind was already racing. He had been in countless high-pressure situations, but this time, he wasn't the one giving the orders. A voice crackled through the police megaphone. "Step out of the vehicle! Hands where I can see them!" James frowned. What was going on? He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a red light. He had done nothing wrong. And yet the officer's tone was filled with aggression. Moving slowly, he reached for the door handle, careful not to make any sudden movements. But before he could even push it open, a loud click rang through the air. The officer had drawn his gun. "On the ground! Now!" James froze, his hands still in plain sight. A gun? For a traffic stop? Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something far worse. What happens next will leave everyone speechless. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more gripping real-life justice stories. James Reynolds kept his hands on the wheel, his muscles tense, his instincts sharper than ever. The officer's voice still rang in his ears, a gun drawn before a question was even asked. He had faced high-risk situations before, but never from this side. He was trained to handle these moments with precision, but he knew that in this case, one wrong move could cost him everything. The night air was still, the quiet suburban road almost deserted. The only sound came from the steady hum of the police car's engine and the distant chirping of crickets. This wasn't a high-crime area. It wasn't the kind of place where officers approached traffic stops with weapons drawn. But here he was, with a loaded gun aimed at him, and he had no idea why. James had spent nearly 4 decades in law enforcement, serving as one of the most respected figures in the FBI. He had overseen major investigations, worked under intense pressure, and helped train some of the best agents in the country. Even in retirement, his presence carried a quiet authority. He wasn't a man who panicked easily. He wasn't a man who acted without reason. Tonight, though, he wasn't being seen as the accomplished lawman he was. The officer outside his car didn't see a retired FBI director. He saw something else, and James knew exactly what that meant. Ryan Keller was a mid-30s officer with a history of excessive force complaints. None had ever led to punishment. He had a reputation for escalating situations instead of de-escalating them. He liked power. He liked control. And most of all, he liked reminding people who had it. Tonight, he had already made up his mind. When he saw James's car, a black luxury sedan cruising through a mostly white neighborhood at night, he didn't think twice before flipping on his sirens. To him, it was suspicious. It didn't matter that the driver had done nothing wrong. The street was quiet, almost too peaceful for the scene that was unfolding. A couple of houses still had porch lights on, but no one had come outside, yet. If this went on any longer, James knew that wouldn't last. Inside his car, he inhaled slowly, keeping his mind clear. He had to play this carefully. He knew how men like Officer Keller worked, quick to assert authority, slow to admit mistakes. James also knew something Keller didn't. He was messing with the wrong man. Keller's voice rang out again. "I said, get on the ground." His grip tightened on his gun, his stance widening as if ready for a takedown. James finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Officer, I am complying. My hands are visible. I am unarmed. can you tell me the reason for this stop?" Keller's eyes flashed with annoyance. He didn't like being questioned. He wanted control. "Don't talk. Hands behind your head." James exhaled through his nose. This was a test. Keller wanted him to argue, to push back, to give him a reason. But James wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. A few porch lights flickered on. Bystanders were beginning to take notice. A few feet away, a second officer pulled up. His radio crackled with dispatch. The situation was escalating, and everyone watching knew it. James knew exactly what would happen next. He just had to be ready for it. James Reynolds remained still, his hands visible, his posture controlled. The second officer's vehicle had just arrived, its headlights casting a stark glow across the tense scene. James could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had trained officers like Keller before, young, aggressive, looking for control rather than justice. He knew exactly what was happening. But what disturbed him more than Keller's hostility was the lack of cause. There had been no violation, no justification for this stop, and certainly no reason for a drawn weapon. This wasn't law enforcement. This was a power play. Officer Keller took a step closer, his gun still trained on James. "I said, hands behind your head," he barked again, his voice edged with impatience. James didn't flinch. He knew that sudden movements could be misinterpreted, and he had no intention of becoming another statistic. "Officer," James said evenly, keeping his voice firm but non-threatening, "I am complying. My hands are visible. I am unarmed. I am simply asking why I have been pulled over." Keller's jaw tightened. He didn't like that James was calm. He wanted fear, submission, something to justify his actions. The fact that this man wasn't breaking down, wasn't panicking, was throwing him off. "I don't have to explain myself to you," Keller snapped. "You need to follow orders." A porch light flickered on in a nearby house. The neighborhood, once still and silent, was waking up to the commotion. People were watching. A few figures stood near windows peering out. A couple across the street had stepped onto their front porch, concern evident in their eyes. James took a slow breath. He wasn't just dealing with an aggressive cop, he was dealing with a man who was waiting for an excuse to escalate. Then Keller made his move. He lunged forward, grabbing James by the collar and yanking him out of the vehicle. James stumbled but remained steady, refusing to resist. He had been in enough confrontations to know that Keller wanted him to fight back. He wanted a reason to use force. But James wasn't giving him one. The second officer, younger, visibly hesitant, stepped forward, looking uncertain. He had heard the dispatch call but hadn't expected to find an unarmed man being forced onto the pavement. Keller," the younger officer said carefully. "What's the charge?" Keller ignored him. "I said, get on the ground." James was now kneeling on the pavement, his eyes locked on Keller's. There was no fear in them, only quiet authority. "This is excessive force," he said simply. "You have no probable cause." Keller's eyes flashed with anger. His grip tightened on his gun. He wanted control, and James wasn't breaking. The second officer swallowed hard. Something about this wasn't right. He had heard the name James Reynolds before, but he couldn't quite place it. Why did this man seem so familiar? And then, just as Keller reached for his cuffs, the second officer's radio crackled. "Dispatch to all units. We have a report of a possible wrongful stop on Ridgeway Drive. Be advised, the driver is James Reynolds, retired FBI director." Silence. Keller stiffened. His fingers twitched. His face went pale. The younger officer's eyes widened. Wait, James Reynolds? As in, Director James Reynolds? James met Keller's gaze, and in that moment, Keller knew. He had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The tension in the air was thick, pressing down on the scene like a storm about to break. Officer Keller's grip on his gun tightened, but his confidence had started to slip. The name James Reynolds had clearly rattled him. The second officer, now fully aware of the situation, took an uneasy step forward. "Sir," the younger officer said carefully, his voice unsure, "I think we need to reassess this situation." Keller's jaw clenched. Reassess? No, he had gone too far to back down now. He had given orders, and this man had the nerve to question them. If he backed off, it would mean admitting he was wrong, and he wasn't about to do that. "I don't care who he is," Keller spat. "He resisted. That's enough." James, still kneeling on the pavement, exhaled slowly. He had seen men, like Keller before, officers who thought a badge gave them the right to do anything. And now, backed into a corner, Keller was making a choice: double down or face the consequences. "I didn't resist," James said calmly, his voice unwavering. "Your body cam footage will prove that." Keller flinched. Body cam. He had been too caught up in asserting his dominance to remember that everything had been recorded. The younger officer now looked even more uncomfortable. His training kicked in. He was starting to realize what was happening. "Sir," he said again, firmer this time, "I strongly suggest you take a step back." Keller's breathing was shallow now. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. The entire situation had flipped. He was no longer the one in control. James slowly got to his feet. He wasn't afraid. He never had been. He had dealt with dangerous criminals, terrorists, men far worse than this officer in front of him. But right now, this was about something bigger. "This isn't going away, Keller," James said, locking eyes with him. "This is your last chance to do the right thing." The words hung in the air. Keller's fingers twitched near his gun, his knuckles turning white. For a split second it seemed like he might do something reckless. But then the sound of another police siren approaching filled the night air. A black, unmarked vehicle pulled up to the curb. The door opened and out stepped Captain Harris. Keller's face drained of color. Harris, a seasoned officer with decades of experience, took one look at the scene before him and knew exactly what had happened. His sharp gaze landed on Keller first, then flicked to the second officer, who immediately straightened in relief. James dusted off his suit jacket, never breaking eye contact with Keller. Harris's voice was calm but carried undeniable authority. "Tell me, Officer Keller," he said, "what exactly is the charge here?" Keller swallowed hard. His mouth opened, then closed. He was resisting. Harris's eyes narrowed. Was he? Because from what I understand, this man, he gestured at James, is James Reynolds, former FBI director. And what I don't understand is why you had him on the ground at gunpoint over a routine traffic stop. The second officer, sensing an opportunity to correct the situation, immediately spoke up. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't believe there was probable cause for the stop." Keller was breathing heavily now. His hands flexed at his sides. The authority he had wielded so recklessly just moments ago was crumbling around him. Harris crossed his arms. Body cam footage will confirm everything, I assume? James gave a slow nod. It will. Keller knew it was over. Harris didn't look away. Officer Keller, hand over your badge and firearm. Effective immediately. The younger officer's eyes widened in shock. The porch lights from the nearby houses flickered brighter, more people stepping outside to watch. The word was spreading fast. An officer was being stripped of his badge right there on the street. Keller's hands shook with barely contained rage. Captain, now! Harris's voice left no room for argument. With shaking hands, Keller removed his badge from his chest and unholstered his gun. The weight of the moment was crushing him. He had thought he was in control, but now he was the one facing judgment. Harris handed Keller's badge to the younger officer. You'll be booked for abuse of power, excessive force, and misconduct. And trust me, the department will make sure your record is fully reviewed. James stepped forward, looking Keller in the eye. How many others? His voice was quiet but powerful. How many times have you done this before? Keller had no answer. He stood frozen, his career destroyed in a single night by his own actions. Harris nodded at James. Sir, I deeply regret that this happened. If you'd like to file formal charges, you have my full support. James took a deep breath. I want full transparency. I want every complaint against this officer reviewed, and I want to make sure this never happens again. Harris nodded firmly. Consider it done. As Keller was placed in the back of a squad car, the weight of what had happened settled over the street. The silence was heavy, filled with realization. Tonight, justice had been served. But James knew the battle wasn't just about this moment. This fight wasn't over. It never would be. As Officer Keller sat in the back of the squad car, his face twisted in disbelief. Just minutes ago, he had been the one in control, barking orders, expecting obedience. Now, he was the one trapped behind locked doors, stripped of his badge, his authority gone in an instant. The cold realization sank in. His career was over, and there was no escaping the consequences. James Reynolds stood nearby, his hands now resting calmly at his sides. He watched as Keller struggled to process what had just happened. James had seen this moment before, officers who believed they were invincible, who thought the system would always protect them. But Keller had miscalculated. He had made one fatal mistake. He had pulled over the wrong man. Captain Harris sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. The weight of the situation wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about a system that had allowed men like Keller to operate unchecked for too long. He turned to James, his tone laced with respect. Sir, I have to ask, do you want to file formal charges against Officer Keller? James studied Keller through the window of the police car. The man who had stood tall, barking commands without hesitation, now looked small and powerless. It was a stark reminder that power is only as strong as the integrity behind it. I want every complaint against him reviewed, James said, his voice steady. Every single one. If this happened to me, it's happened to others, and they deserve justice too. The younger officer, who had hesitated earlier but ultimately helped de-escalate the situation, stepped forward. His expression was a mix of unease and realization. Sir, if I may, he said, his voice careful, I think there's something you should know. James turned to him, his interest piqued. Go on. The officer hesitated before glancing at Harris. The captain nodded, signaling him to continue. Officer Keller has had multiple complaints filed against him, the officer admitted, his voice low but firm. Excessive force, racial profiling, abuse of power. But none of them ever stuck. The reports would disappear. The cases would get buried. Every time someone spoke up, it was their word against his. James's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. Keller's confidence, his arrogance, it hadn't come from nowhere. He had gotten away with this before. Harris exhaled, shaking. His head. "I should have pushed harder," he admitted. "I should have seen the signs." James looked back at Keller, who now sat staring blankly ahead, his hands resting in his lap. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a pattern that had finally caught up to him. "You know what the worst part is?" James said quietly, his voice laced with controlled anger. "If I weren't who I am, this would have ended differently. No backup, no accountability, just another case swept under the rug." The words hung in the air. The truth was undeniable. Harris straightened. "Not this time. We're taking this all the way." James nodded. For the first time that night he allowed himself to breathe. Not because justice had fully been served, but because, for once, the system had done what it was supposed to do. But he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. James Reynolds watched as Officer Keller sat motionless in the back of the squad car, his face void of the arrogance he had displayed just moments ago. The once powerful officer, who had pulled his gun without hesitation, now sat behind locked doors, stripped of his authority. For the first time, Keller was experiencing what it felt like to be powerless. Captain Harris took a deep breath, then turned to James. "Sir, I give you my word. This department is going to handle this the right way. Keller won't get away with this." James nodded, his sharp gaze still fixed on the officer inside the car. "See that you do," he said, his voice steady but laced with meaning. "Because if this happened to me, it's happened to others. And those people may not have had the power to fight back." The younger officer, who had hesitated earlier but ultimately stepped up when it mattered, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir," he said carefully, his voice holding a note of shame, "I should have spoken up sooner. When I saw how Keller was handling things, I knew something wasn't right. But I froze." James turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "Recognizing the problem is the first step," he said, "but what matters now is what you do next. Staying silent when you know something is wrong makes you part of the problem. Are you going to be part of the problem or the solution?" The young officer swallowed hard before nodding. "I want to be part of the solution." James gave a small nod. "Then start by making sure every one of Keller's past cases is reviewed. Every complaint, every report, people need to know the truth." Harris stepped forward. "I'll personally see to it. Keller isn't the first officer who's abused his power, but he's going to be the first in this department to face real consequences. The days of covering for men like him are over." James exhaled, a small but meaningful victory settling over him. He had spent his career fighting corruption, ensuring justice was upheld. Even in retirement, it seemed that battle hadn't ended. But tonight proved something important. Change was possible. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but it was possible. The street, once filled with tension and fear, was now quiet. The neighbors who had stood watching from their porches had seen everything. They had witnessed not just an abuse of power, but accountability in action. And that, James knew, was what really mattered. As Keller was driven away, his face pale, his future uncertain, James finally turned toward his car. The night air felt lighter now, the weight of what had happened slowly lifting. Harris walked beside him. "You know, Director, you could have pressed charges yourself. You could have made an example of him." James opened his car door but paused before getting in. "I didn't need to," he said. "His own actions did that for him." Harris nodded in understanding. "What will you do now?" James looked out at the quiet street, then back at the captain. "The same thing I've always done. Make sure people like Keller don't get the last word." With that, James slid into his car, started the engine, and pulled away, leaving behind a night that would be remembered not just for the injustice that almost happened, but for the justice that finally did. As James Reynolds drove away from the scene, the flashing red and blue lights faded in his rearview mirror. The night had been a reminder of something he already knew. Power, when placed in the wrong hands, becomes dangerous. Keller had believed he was above the law, but tonight proved otherwise. Tonight, justice had caught up with him. James took a deep breath as he pulled on to the main road. He had spent his life ensuring fairness in the justice system, but the work was never done. There would always be another Keller, another officer who used their badge as a weapon rather than a responsibility. But there would also be people who stood up, who refused to stay silent. And that was how change happened, one voice at a time. Captain Harris had promised a full review of Keller's record. The young officer had chosen to step up and become part of the solution. Steps had been taken in the right direction. But James knew that justice wasn't about one night. It was about holding people accountable every time they crossed the line. James's story is one that happens far too often. But this time, the truth came out. The system worked, but only because people refused to look away. If you saw this happening, would you step in? Would you speak up? Injustice thrives in silence, but change starts with those who refuse to stay quiet. If this story resonated with you, share it. Let's remind the world that justice prevails when people stand together. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real-life inspired stories. See you in the next one.